I am delighted to see so many of you here this evening to hear Frye and me talk about the Southernization of America, a story of democracy in the balance, and we are looking forward to hearing from you as well. As Darrell said earlier, in 1974, the great Southern journalist John Egerton wrote a book of essays called The Americanization of Dixie, the Southernization of America. He was reflecting on the fact that the South was becoming more fully integrated into the rest of the nation. It was no longer an isolated region with the advent of interstate highways and television, and today we would say, and the internet. But Egerton wasn't so sure that the South and the nation were exchanging strengths. He was worried that maybe they were exchanging sins. He talked about the increasing commercialization of the South, malls everywhere. He talked about the loss of a sense of community and identity. And he talked, of course, about the nation's original sin, which had been so horribly a lived experience for so many in the South, racism. He talked about the fact that racism, which we Southerners had known, seemed to be emanating into other areas of the country. Perhaps it had always been there, but it seemed to be coming alive in distinct ways that didn't seem to indicate progress. In early 2020, an editor at a small publishing house in Montgomery, Alabama, New South Books, got in touch with Frye and asked him if he could do a follow-up to Egerton's book. And Frye said he'd be delighted to do so and asked if I could be invited into the project. I was honored when Frye thought enough of my work to invite me in. So we too have written a series of essays starting chronologically at about the same point where Egerton left off, in the 1970s. But we don't think of our book as a history. It's not. It's an impressionistic account. Frye and I talk about the political and cultural moments that we believe are important in shaping where we are now, the point that we have come to. There were some strange political currents in 2020, and writing the book helped me to process what was going on in the country at the moment. Frye and I, one of the reasons I was so honored to be asked to be part of this project is that Frye and I grew up in the South at about the same time, but on different sides of the racial divide. He was on the privileged side. I wasn't. But we have come to see the South and the nation in much the same way, both the peril and the promise. And we believe that our appearances together are a visual representation of what we hope that the nation, and the South in particular, can come to look like moving forward. Frye is going to talk some and read some from the book, and then I will talk some more. Before we invite you to ask questions, But I would like to reiterate what Darrell said earlier. I am often disappointed when Frye and I make appearances and all the questions come from people whose politics are much like ours. We believe that very strongly, that this democracy is at an inflection point. We believe that the democracy in the United States has shown its fragility of late. We chose the subtitle for our book very deliberately, A Story of Democracy in the Balance. One of the things we believe that is critical in a strong democracy is the ability of people who disagree to be able to disagree respectfully and civilly. So please, don't sit there thinking, well, I don't think that's right, and not say anything. We want to hear from you whether you agree or disagree or offer something that neither of us has ever thought about. I'm looking forward to our conversation this evening.
So everybody's saying it, but I will too. What Cynthia said about dialogue and the importance of it, and the critical importance of us in this country learning how to talk about things again, learning how to disagree with respect and civility if we disagree, being open to learning things from each other that maybe we had not thought about before. So it is in that spirit that we were happy to accept Darrell's invitation. What I'm going to do is read a little bit from the book, just enough to give you a sense of the flavor of the writing and the way we approach the subjects, talk a little bit more, and then toss it back to Cynthia, and then she'll kind of wind things up from our point of view, and then we'd like to hear from you. So I'm going to start with the beginning of the book, where we talk about the journalist John Edgerton, who inspired us to write what we have written. John Edgerton was, as those of us who knew him could attest, one of the great and gentle souls of his time, a man deeply committed to racial justice, who wanted badly to believe that it would be a good thing if this troubled place in which he lived, this part of America that had once fought a war for the right to own slaves, could emerge from the strife of the civil rights years, somehow chastened and wiser for the journey, if it could narrow its distance from the rest of the country and perhaps even lead it toward better days. That was the hope. But Edgerton, as was his habit, saw darker, gloomier possibilities as well. Giving voice to his fears, he wrote, "The South and the nation are not exchanging strengths so much as they are exchanging sins. More often than not, they are sharing and spreading the worst in each other while the best languishes and withers." For a while, it was easy enough to make the case that Edgerton's gloom was misplaced, or at least overstated. The anecdotal evidence was all around. In Virginia, Republican Governor Linwood Holton had stunned political observers when he was elected in 1969 on a promise of racial reconciliation and inclusion. In contrast to the Southern Democrats who had controlled Virginia for 100 years, Holton proclaimed that the era of defiance, of resistance to civil rights progress was coming to an end. He supported school desegregation, appointed women and minorities to state government, and promised to make Virginia a model in race relations. In Florida, new Democratic Governor Reuben Askew sounded nearly identical themes. And he set such a standard for integrity and competence that Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government rated him one of the top 10 governors of the 20th century. And of course, there was Jimmy Carter. Elected governor of Georgia in 1970, Carter proclaimed in his inaugural address that the time for racial discrimination is over. Easily the most ambitious of those New South champions, he soon set out for the presidency with Southernness at the heart of his appeal. "I've been the product of an emerging South," he said. "I see the clear advantages of throwing off the millstone of racial prejudice. I think it's a process that's comparable with the moral and ethical standards of our nation, the heritage of our country as envisioned by our forefathers. I also see that we have a special responsibility here. When we are meek or quiescent or silent on the subject of civil rights at home or human rights abroad, there is no other voice on earth that can replace the lost voice, the absent voice of the United States. That is what the persecutors want, and that is what the persecuted fear." For many Americans, it was mesmerizing. A peanut farmer from the deepest South, reconnecting the country with its finest ideals. In 1976, when Carter won the Democratic nomination, he stood side by side at the National Convention, gazing out across the sea of delegates with Martin Luther King Sr. There they were, two native Georgians, one black, one white, a Southern governor and a civil rights lion, sharing a moment that felt like a revival, not only of the Christian faith they both proclaimed, but of a dream deferred, of shining hopes and possibilities in which so many of us wanted to believe. "Surely the Lord," shouted Daddy King over the mad cacophony of music and cheers amid descending balloons, "is in this place." There was intoxication in the moment, but we knew it was shadowed by something very different, the realities John Edgerton was writing about. In the presidential election of 1968, Richard Nixon had embarked on a Southern strategy, and he did not mean the things Jimmy Carter was telling us. In a sense, Nixon's mentor had been George Wallace. He watched in private admiration as the Alabama governor, who had pledged in 1963 his commitment to segregation forever, learned to redefine his appeal. In the presidential election the presidential primaries of 1964 and 68, Wallace spoke more obliquely about race, almost as if he were teaching the nation how to think in code. From the time he famously stood in the schoolhouse door, he had begun to polish that skill. Everybody understood in the summer of 1963 the mission at hand, how Wallace had embarked on a doomed, quixotic quest to block the admission of black students Vivian Malone and James Hood to the University of Alabama. But just as secessionists 100 years earlier had talked about states' rights when what they really meant was slavery, Wallace cast the federal government as a bully, an outside force pursuing integration without regard to the will of the people, and himself as a noble defender of freedom. A few years later, on the campaign trail for the presidency, he found it useful not to mention segregation, but to talk about liberal sob sisters or some bearded Washington bureaucrat who can't even park a bicycle straight. All the shared resentments were there, but he and his audience felt shielded from the charge, his accusers frustrated as they attempted to make it that they were bigots at heart. There were times, however, when he couldn't contain himself. Once in 1968, he invoked the specter of urban riots, those moments when African American rage, sometimes in response to police brutality, erupted into violence, became, in a sense, a magnified reflection of the crime. "We don't have riots down in Alabama," Wallace roared, bantamweight defiance flashing in his eyes. "They start a riot down there, first one of them to pick up a brick gets a bullet to the brain, and then you walk over to the next one and say, 'All right, pick up a brick. We just want to see you pick up one of them bricks now. Newsman Douglas Kiker of NBC, observing the response of a Midwestern crowd, was struck by a sudden horrifying epiphany. They all hate black people, all of them. They're all afraid. Great God, that's it. They're all Southern. The whole United States is Southern. There were African American activists, people like James Baldwin or Malcolm X, who begged to differ. Both had written with urgency about the indigenous racism of the North. But if the story was more complicated, if racism had already taken root in every nook and corner of America, was there nevertheless something in Kiker's moment of revelation? In this era of homogenization, when television and interstate highways, and soon enough the internet, were erasing the isolation of the South, pulling it into the national mainstream, was there something about our place that was beginning to reshape the country? And if there was, might it be a source of mystical promise, or was it more inevitably a reality overflowing with dread? That's a question that we continue to address as we go forward with the story in the book. And we find it to be a mixed story. Even sometimes in the very same moment, we find it to be mixed. Take, for example, the presidential election of 1988. The Republican candidate was a patrician man, George H.W. Bush, who had, without any question, a deeply felt sense of public service. He had held many offices and aspired now to the highest office in the land. He carried himself with dignity and generosity and grace. But as he ran for the presidency at the very beginning of his race against a now forgotten Democrat from Massachusetts named Michael Dukakis, Bush was 17 points behind in the polls. And he had a young political strategist from South Carolina who worked for him, a young man, talented young man in his 30s named Lee Atwater. And Lee Atwater believed that they had to do something drastic to narrow the gap in the polls. And so he found that opportunity, he thought, when they realized that while Dukakis was the governor of Massachusetts, he had allowed there to be a weekend furlough program for prisoners in Massachusetts penitentiaries. And one of the people who was allowed to leave the penitentiary on a weekend furlough was a convicted murderer serving life without parole named Willie Horton. Willie Horton was an African-American man. He left for the weekend and didn't come back. Instead, he raped a white woman, pistol whipped her boyfriend, and demonstrated that he was a criminal who had not been rehabilitated in any way. By the time we're finished, Atwater promised, they're going to wonder whether Willie Horton is Michael Dukakis' running mate. Bush talked about the issue on the campaign trail, but it was a television ad produced conveniently by a conservative PAC, not officially connected to the campaign, that touched the marrow of American fear. There on the nation's television sets was a shadowy photograph of Horton, scowling, bearded, projecting a kind of arrogant menace that could chill a white American to the bone. Even without the words of the announcer, you could imagine the kind of things Willie Horton would do, the kinds of things he had already done, things that any of them might do, abetted by politicians weak on crime. That was the theory and effect of the ad, not a kernel of truth in the issue, the wisdom of a furlough program available to violent offenders, but broader racial fears in the country so easily conflated with the issue of crime. Now, Later on, Lee Atwater was sorry about this. He was sorry about it because he realized as he was approaching his 40th birthday that he was dying of cancer. And it was the kind of thing that brought an intelligent and in many ways decent young man up short. And he realized that he was not trying in this ad that he had sanctioned as a campaign strategist. He was not trying to create a significant debate on the issue of crime and punishment in America. He was trying to appeal to racial fear and racial resentment. And he wrote an article for Life magazine, and in that article he said, "I'm sorry I did this. And I hope that America can learn something," he said, "on my dime." And our fear is that the lessons have still not taken root that Atwater hoped we might learn on his dime. And that in fact, the politics of division in the country have become even more extreme after the new millennium. There were a couple of things that contributed to that, a couple of things that maybe make it a little more understandable, if no less dangerous. One of those was on September 11th, 2001, when airplanes flew into the Twin Towers in New York City and into the Pentagon. Thousands of Americans died at that moment. And we knew that people very different from us had done this terrible thing. Muslim radicals, Islamic terrorists, had plotted this hideous deed that punctured our sense of invulnerability in this country. Really not since the War of 1812, when the British were fighting with us on the American mainland and actually did damage to the White House, had a foreign entity, not a government in this case, but still an organized foreign entity, managed to attack us in this way, on this kind of scale, on our own turf, and it was terrifying. Now, it didn't really matter to a lot of us to know that the majority of the victims of this particular version of Islamic terrorism were in fact Muslims themselves. In places in the Middle East where ISIS and Al-Qaeda tried to enforce their rule, they killed thousands upon thousands of their fellow Muslims. But there was this kind of elemental fear of the other that Americans began to feel, we think, in a way that many of us had not felt it before. And in the complicated psychology of all of this, a few years later, something else happened that at first, people like Cynthia and me thought was a major plateau, a plateau of progress that could not be reversed in this country. And that was when a brilliant young African-American man with a beautiful family was elected President of the United States. Cynthia and I didn't necessarily think that meant there were no racial issues in the country anymore, but we were proud of America for being able to do this, particularly because Barack Obama was running himself against another good man, John McCain, who was a Republican and so with different policy ideas, different values in some ways, but there was at least some sense that Americans were making a choice between two people who cared about this country. Now, as Obama's presidency went on, it became controversial in some ways, and in many ways that's fair enough. Every president has policies that ought to be debated, that it's fair enough to disagree with. You might have disagreed with Obama about immigration or whatever it might have been. Was he strong enough? Did he make the right decisions in dealing with the war in Syria, those kinds of things? But that wasn't all that happened. There was also a kind of ad hominem smearing of the President of the United States. People who said that he wasn't born in this country, which was not true. He was. He was born in Hawaii. People who said he was not a Christian, but a Muslim. In fact, he was a member of the United Church of Christ. And if you read his books, he was a person who had thought deeply and broadly about questions of faith. If you ever read his speech that he gave to the National Prayer Breakfast, there can be no doubt about that. And yet, for many Americans, the President of the United States was seen as kind of an other also. And the politics of division became more deeply entrenched and more deeply the reality that the country had to deal with. And we believe that reached a particular inflection point in 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidential nomination of his party, and the politics of grievance was at the very heart of his appeal. And whether it was dealing with Republican opponents like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio of Florida or Ted Cruz of Texas, or whether it was dealing with his Democratic rivals from the other party, or whether it was talking about a whole group of people who live to the south of us who we think he tarred with the brush of criminality in a way that went far beyond the reality. Donald Trump became a symbol of division in this country that made some of us feel division in a way that we had not before. I live in an area outside of Mobile where most of my friends and neighbors don't agree with me politically. I had the only Obama sign in the neighborhood. In 2008, nobody cared about that. The people at the restaurant that my wife and I love to go to, kind of with a little bit of a smile, referred to us as the professors. We both taught at the university. And there was a certain admiration and a certain bemusement in the way they used the term, the professors, to describe us. And they knew that we liked and respected them for their neighborliness and for the values that of kindness that we saw in their lives every day. But sometime around 2016 or a little later, those kind of conversations began to take on an edge and it became harder maybe to see the humanity in each other that we had taken for granted and had celebrated up to that point. Do I blame Donald Trump for all of this? No, I don't. But I do think it is a problem that all of us have got to figure out how to get past. We live in a country that is multicultural, it is multiracial. We can make the best of that, we can make the worst of that. And the choice is really ours, but we have to, I think, Cynthia and I think, learn how to talk again the way we used to. I remember when I first got out of college, the 1960s had been a time of great division in the country, and I had changed my political views from those that many family members held at that time. And I was very fond of going home and lecturing all my relatives about the error of their ways. I was 21 years old and, knew most of what there was to know. And I was, I'm sure, quite the irritant. And along in there, I read an article in Harper's Magazine that was the whole issue of Harper's. and it was called Listening to America, and it was written by Bill Moyers. Great, not only political advocate in Lyndon Johnson's administration, but also a ordained Baptist who took his faith seriously. And what Moyers wrote is that, in that article, was that the veneer of civility, that's what he called it, had been stripped away in this country. And you think of a veneer as something on the surface and therefore maybe not as real. But he argued that not only is it real, it's essential, and that without that veneer of civility, that willingness to encounter people in the first instance with a sense of respect, that without that, the country is in real trouble. And I found that as I read that article that it brought me up short, because I realized Bill Moyers was talking to me, among other people, in the way that I had handled political disagreements. So if those crop up tonight, I hope to do better than I did when I was 21. Cynthia, do you want to talk from that point to where we think we find ourselves today?
Absolutely. You can get a sense of why I've enjoyed working with him so much. We followed through the Trump presidency some of the political developments that, again, we thought were most important. And one of those that we focused on was the way that a Southern governor responded to the massacre at a historic Black church in Charleston. The massacre at Charleston's Mother Emanuel actually took place before the Trump presidency in 2015. And one of the things that happened after that was that many political leaders, including many white Southern leaders, began to rethink the way that so many public spaces throughout the South honored Confederate iconography. I grew up in a tiny little town in southern Alabama, Monroeville, Alabama. If it's known for anything, it is known as the birthplace of Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. I grew up in a place where not only were there monuments to Confederate generals all over the place, but when I was a little girl, and I think it is still true that in Alabama, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. But Dylan Roof, who committed the massacre at Mother Emanuel, had shown his belief in white supremacy, among other ways, by curating on his social media sites lots and lots of Confederate iconography, rebel flags, among other things. And so after the massacre, many Southerners in particular began to acknowledge that there was something wrong with the way that the South had continued to pretend that the Confederate cause had been an honorable one, all about states' rights. Now, it is interesting, though, one of the interesting things that I noted was that Donald Trump was a big defender of Confederate iconography, although he grew up in New York City, and as far as I know, had no relatives, no ancestors with any connection to the Civil War or the Confederate cause. Nevertheless, in South Carolina, in Richmond, Virginia, in Louisiana, and other places, many Southern white politicians began to take note of the fact that the Confederacy had been misrepresented and that there was no reason for Confederate monuments to be held up in public spaces. The Pentagon decided that it would be a good idea to rename military bases that had been named in honor of Confederate generals. President Trump protested that. Nevertheless, a defense bill was passed that included provisions to rename those bases, and the Pentagon has set about the business of doing that. I consider that, Frye and I consider that, a big step forward, and one, again, that is taking place largely in the South. I want to point out, however, that Confederate iconography is not restricted to the South. You find Confederate iconography as far away as Montana. I leave you to think about what that might mean and what that says about the Southernization of America. During the same period when those changes were taking place, something else happened. A black man named George Floyd was killed by a white police officer in Minneapolis, partly because there was so much cell phone video of the way in which he died. There was no doubt that not only had excessive force been used, but that Derek Chauvin should be charged, and he was, and convicted. But that death sparked a summer of protest. The Black Lives Matter movement took hold across the country, sponsored largely peaceful demonstrations all over the nation in big cities and small towns, and actually in cities across the world. There were protests in sympathy with the Black Lives Matter cause all around the world. On every continent, there were protests. One of the stranger and more worrisome things that happened was that during a protest, a peaceful protest near the White House and near the Capitol, the president, then President Trump, was outraged enough that he thought federal troops should be called in to clear these protesters away. In fact, they were cleared away enough for him to march across the street for a photo op at a church across the street. Many of us, I think, saw that as, at best, at minimum, overreach, because the protesters had every right to be there. One of the things that also happened when the president made his march across the street to an Episcopal church, I believe St. John's Episcopal Church, was that he insisted that some military officers, including General Mark Milley, walk with him. And Mark Milley did. Later, Mark Milley apologized for that because he realized, probably even as he was walking across the street with the president, that this was a misuse of military forces. That his oath was to protect the Constitution, and there is a long tradition in the Pentagon of staying out of politics. Those were some of the reasons, I think, that the 2020 election cycle attracted so many voters. There were some very important things about American democracy that were at stake in that election. And the Democratic nominee turned out to be Joseph Biden. Biden had run for the presidency twice before. He had never even won a primary. You may recall that it seemed that the leading Democratic contender at that point was Bernie Sanders. But in South Carolina, a South Carolina congressman named James Clyburn, an African-American congressman, stepped forward a couple of days before the South Carolina primary to endorse Joe Biden, and the rest is history. Biden rolled through the primaries after that and became the nominee. He even won some states that had traditionally been Republican. He won Arizona, and he won Georgia, a state where I covered politics for many, many more years than I care to say. But for me, the most interesting thing about the 2020 election in Georgia wasn't that Joe Biden won. It was that Georgia sent 2 Democrats to the U.S. Senate. They sent the first ever Black U.S. Senator from Georgia, Raphael Warnock, and the first ever Jewish American senator from Georgia, John Ossoff. I was particularly heartened by the fact that toward the end of their campaign, Ossoff and Warnock often campaigned together. And one of the things that I liked so much about that was that it harkened back to an old alliance. Throughout the civil rights movement, throughout the 50s and 1960s, there had been many Jewish Americans who not only supported the civil rights movement with money, but who marched, and some even lost their lives. That history has been forgotten, I think, and so I was heartened by the fact that I thought that Warnock and Ossoff were bringing that history back to the forefront. Donald Trump, however, insisted that he didn't lose that election. And I don't have to remind you what happened after that. But his insistence that he didn't lose wasn't restricted to one person. That's the dangerous part of this. I think his insistence that the election was stolen through fraud, something that judges throughout the country, up to the Supreme Court, have rejected, and that includes judges and justices who were appointed by Republicans. They have seen no evidence that the election was stolen through fraud. But that has seeped down into the Republican Party, so that there were a number of election deniers who ran for important races in the midterms. And that includes Kari Lake, who ran for governor of Arizona. The good news is that not a single election denier won an important office. None won governor's races, and none won races for Secretary of State, where they could have done real harm to the electoral process. I am so encouraged by the results of the midterms, not necessarily because I wanted Democrats, big D, to win. I wanted Democrats, small d, to win. You know, Brian Kemp won re-election in Georgia. He is a conservative Republican, but he had the good sense and the courage when Donald Trump was pressuring him to say that Trump had won Georgia, find me 11,000 votes. Kemp and the conservative Republican Secretary of State, Raffensperger, I have trouble pronouncing his name, I'm still working on that, they both won re-election. They are conservative Republicans, large R, but they are also Democrats, small d. They support the fundamentals of the democratic process. The danger, however, isn't over, because again, so much of this election denial, so much of this insistence on believing a lie has seeped down into the Republican base. Having spent more years than I care to say as a journalist, nothing disappoints me more. Nothing makes me question all those years I spent in the news business more than the fact that so many people believe things that are not true. I really worry about the way conspiracy theories have taken hold among people who should know better. I worry about the way misinformation spreads so quickly with social media. And as somebody who grew up Baptist in Alabama, I worry about the way that so many conservative Christian churches have taken on a theology that I don't recognize. It looks like white nationalism to me. If you look at video footage of the insurrection on January 6, 2021, you will see that many of the insurrectionists are carrying Christian iconography. There's one guy running up the steps about to smash into some police officers holding a Bible. There are lots of Christian flags in the crowd. There are people who have banners that say, Jesus is Lord and Trump is president. I find that worrisome. So all of that is my way of saying I was encouraged by the midterm results, but I don't think that American democracy is out of the woods yet. I think it's still in a fragile state. The good news is we all get to have a say in the way that things turn out.